Have you ever watched someone deliberately ignore your "please keep off the grass" sign while maintaining direct eye contact with you through your living room window? Well, I have. And let me tell you, it's an experience that will make your blood boil in ways you never thought possible. But sometimes the best revenge isn't served cold, it's served wet, very wet. Hey everyone, what I'm about to share isn't just a story about sprinklers, entitled neighbors, or even an HOA gone wild. It's about standing up for yourself when others won't respect your boundaries. And trust me, by the end of this video, you'll either be reaching for your nearest sprinkler catalog or thanking your lucky stars that you don't live in Oakridge Heights. Before I dive into how I transform my front yard into an impromptu shower facility for unsuspecting HOA board members, let me paint you a picture of how it all started. You know those perfect spring mornings where everything just feels right. The sun's warming up the dew on your freshly mowed lawn, birds are doing their thing, and you're sipping coffee on your porch, admiring the results of countless weekends spent on lawn care. That was my life every Saturday morning at 7 a.m. sharp. See, I'm Mark Wilson, and I just spent the last 8 months turning what was essentially a dirt patch into the kind of lawn that makes golf courses jealous. We're talking perfectly edged borders, strategically placed flower beds, and grass so green it looked photoshopped in real life. I'd moved to Oakridge Heights because the houses were beautiful, the neighborhood was quiet, and yes, I actually liked the idea of an HOA keeping things neat and tidy. Call me crazy, but I believed in the system. That is, until I met Linda Baker, HOA board president and self-proclaimed guardian of community standards. You see those paths worn into my grass? Those aren't random. Those are what I like to call Linda lines, the exact routes that Linda and her HOA cronies would take while crossing my lawn every single day to get to their power walking group, meeting at Susan Mitchell's house. It's like they thought property lines were just friendly suggestions. I tried being nice about it. I really did. First, I put up tasteful "please use the sidewalk" signs. They disappeared overnight. Apparently, they violated community aesthetics guidelines. Then I installed a decorative white picket fence, only to receive a violation notice claiming it wasn't the exact shade of white specified in the HOA handbook. The handbook that mysteriously no one could provide me a copy of. But here's the kicker, and this is what really got me started on my path to sprinkler supremacy. One morning, I caught Linda leading an entire group of power walkers across my lawn while giving what appeared to be an impromptu HOA orientation tour. She was literally using my property damage as a teaching moment. And this is why we need to implement stricter landscaping guidelines in the community. The audacity of it all hit me harder than the property tax bill. Here I was, spending every free moment maintaining this lawn to their exacting standards, while they treated it like their personal shortcut. Something had to give, and it wasn't going to be my grass anymore. That's when I met Tom Rodriguez, my next-door neighbor and retired engineer. He was out watering his plants when he saw me staring at the worn paths in my lawn with what I can only assume was the look of a man about to lose it. "You know," he said, leaning over our shared fence, "there's more than one way to water a lawn." The gleam in his eye told me he wasn't just talking about garden hoses and sprinklers. Tom, as it turned out, had his own history with Linda and the HOA board. And more importantly, he had ideas. The kind of ideas that would make any HOA board member think twice about taking shortcuts across someone's property. Little did Linda know, but her daily power walks were about to get a lot more refreshing. And that's where our story really begins. Welcome back. Last time, I introduced you to my perfectly maintained lawn and its uninvited guests. Now let me show you how a simple chat with my neighbor Tom turned into what the local kids would later call the Great Sprinkler Uprising of Oakridge Heights. The morning after my chat with Tom, I woke up to find 3 new sets of footprints, cutting diagonal paths across my dewy lawn. But instead of the usual frustration, I felt something different. Anticipation. You see, Tom hadn't just offered suggestions. He'd slipped me a full technical diagram for what he called the lawn protection protocol. Picture this. Motion-activated sprinkler heads strategically placed to create overlapping coverage zones. Not your regular garden variety sprinklers, mind you. These were professional-grade irrigation heads capable of rotating 360 degrees in under a second. Tom had even calculated the optimal water pressure needed to make a point without causing any actual harm. Just enough to ensure that anyone cutting across my lawn would arrive at their destination looking like they'd run through a car wash. But before I could implement Tom's masterpiece of hydraulic engineering, something happened that made my blood run cold. I spotted Linda Baker and Susan Mitchell standing at the edge of my property, gesturing animatedly while taking photos with their phones. "Mark!" Linda's voice cut through the morning air like a badly tuned wind chime. "We need to discuss your lawn maintenance schedule. The grass height is precisely 0, 2 inches above regulation." I stepped outside, measuring tape dangling from Linda's hand like a weapon of mass documentation. But what caught my eye wasn't the tape, it was the fresh set of footprints leading straight from where they stood to my front door. They'd walked across the lawn just to tell me my grass was too tall. That's when I met Emily Chen, the local landscaper who happened to be working on my neighbor's yard. She'd overheard everything and waited until Linda and Susan power walked their way back across my lawn, yes, again, before approaching me. "You know," Emily said, examining the worn paths in my grass, "I've worked in 5 different HOA communities, and I've never seen board members so blatantly disregard property boundaries." She pulled out her phone, showing me photos of my lawn from various angles. "I've been documenting the damage they're causing. This isn't just about aesthetics anymore. They're actually destroying your root system." Emily's photos were eye-opening. The constant foot traffic had created compacted, soil paths that would take months to recover. But more importantly, she'd captured timestamps and multiple instances of Linda and her group using my lawn as their personal shortcut, all while carrying HOA violation notices for other neighbors. The irony would be hilarious if it weren't so frustrating, Emily said, shaking her head. "They're literally breaking down your lawn while writing citations for other people's grass being too tall." That's when Tom reappeared, this time with an unexpected ally, Dave Anderson from the local hardware store. Dave had overheard Tom picking up parts for our sprinkler project and couldn't resist joining in. Turns out Linda had tried to get his store removed from the HOA's approved vendors list because he refused to give board members a special discount. "They've got everything you need in stock," Dave said with a grin that suggested he'd been waiting for someone to stand up to the HOA, including some really interesting sprinkler control systems that can be programmed to create quite the water show. As we stood there planning, Jennifer Walsh from the community Facebook group walked by. On the sidewalk, I might add. She'd been documenting HOA overreach for months and had created quite the following among frustrated residents. "You know," Jennifer said, pulling out her phone, "if something interesting were to happen to certain board members during their daily power walks, I know about 200 neighbors who would love to see that footage." The pieces were falling into place. I had Tom's engineering expertise, Emily's professional documentation, Dave's hardware supply connection, and Jennifer's social media reach. But more importantly, I had the law on my side. After a quick check of local ordinances, I confirmed that property owners have every right to install irrigation systems for lawn maintenance. That afternoon, I invested in a high-end security camera system from Mike Peterson, who was more than happy to ensure we captured every angle of what was about to unfold. "For documentation purposes," he said with a knowing smile. As the sun Set on what had started as just another day of HOA frustration, I looked at my lawn and smiled. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, Linda and her power-walking posse would learn that sometimes karma comes with a high-pressure spray nozzle. Drop a comment below if you've ever had to get creative with protecting your property. What's the most interesting solution you've seen? And how much would you pay to see your local HOA board members do an unexpected dance through a sprinkler system? It was Wednesday morning, power walking day for Linda's HOA crew. I was already awake, sitting at my kitchen window with a fresh cup of coffee. Tom was coincidentally doing some early morning gardening, and Jennifer Walsh had her phone ready for her morning walk. The stage was set. The sprinkler system we'd installed wasn't visible unless you knew where to look. Dave from the hardware store had helped us choose specialized pop-up heads that sat completely flush with the lawn when inactive. Emily had even recommended we paint them the exact shade of green to match my grass, which according to Linda's last measurement was still 2 inches too tall.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
We'd set up 3 zones of coverage. Zone 1 activated when someone stepped off the sidewalk onto my lawn. Just a gentle warning spray, enough to say, hey, maybe reconsider your path. Zone 2 kicked in if they continued, creating what Tom called the point of no return spray pattern. And Zone 3? Well, that was our masterpiece, a 360-degree celebration of hydro-engineering that would make any water park proud. Right on schedule, I spotted Linda leading her group. Susan Mitchell, 2 new HOA board members I didn't recognize, and a potential recruit they were trying to impress. They were all wearing their matching Oakridge Heights community leadership power walking outfits, you know, the ones with the reflective HOA logos. Linda was mid-sentence, probably explaining another one of her community improvement ideas when she stepped onto my lawn. The first sprinkler head emerged silently, like a submarine periscope, and delivered its gentle warning spray. The look on Linda's face was priceless. First confusion, then realization, followed by that special kind of entitled anger I'd grown so familiar with. But instead of turning back, she did exactly what we'd hoped. She tried to hurry across. Zone 2 activated. 3 more sprinkler heads emerged in perfect synchronization. Linda's power walk turned into what I can only describe as a startled speed walk. Susan, trying to keep up, triggered Zone 3. What happened next was better than anything we could have choreographed. The full sprinkler array activated in its programmed sequence, creating what Tom later described as a ballet of behavioral correction. Linda and her group performed a magnificent impromptu dance routine across my lawn, complete with squeals, jumps, and some impressively high steps. Jennifer, bless her heart, captured everything in glorious HD. The way Linda's carefully styled hair deflated under the spray, the moment Susan's expensive fitness tracker went flying, and the potential recruit's graceful backward stumble onto the safety of the sidewalk. It was all documented for posterity. But the best part, the entire sequence lasted exactly 15 seconds, and not a single drop of water landed on the sidewalk. Tom's calculations were perfect. As Linda and her group stood on the sidewalk, dripping and disheveled, I decided it was time to make my appearance. I stepped outside, wearing my best concerned neighbor expression. "Oh my goodness," I called out, walking toward them on the sidewalk. "Are you all okay? I just installed this new irrigation system yesterday. It's on a timer for early morning lawn maintenance." I had no idea anyone would be cutting across the grass at this hour. Linda's mascara was running, but her rage was waterproof. This is deliberate harassment," she sputtered, trying to maintain her dignity while wringing out her power-walking jacket. "Harassment," I replied, holding up my phone with Emily's documented lawn damage photos. "You mean like repeatedly trespassing on private property, despite multiple requests to use the sidewalk?" or like issuing violation notices about grass height while actively destroying that same grass. The potential recruit was already backing away, suddenly very interested in her phone. Susan was trying to find her fitness tracker in the grass, using the sidewalk this time. The two new board members were having what appeared to be a serious conversation about taking different routes on future walks. "I've documented everything," I continued pleasantly. "The damage to my lawn, the multiple instances of trespassing, and now I have proof that my new irrigation system works exactly as intended, maintaining my lawn's health by providing regular water coverage. Everything is up to HOA code." Of course. Linda opened her mouth to respond, but at that moment Tom called out from his yard. "Hey Mark, great sprinkler system, really thorough coverage. You know, I think the HOA guidelines specifically recommend morning watering to maintain that regulation grass height." The morning after the sprinkler incident, I woke up to find 3 official-looking vehicles parked outside my house. A city water inspector, a code enforcement officer, and what appeared to be an environmental compliance agent were all huddled around my front yard, with Linda Baker standing triumphantly. Nearby, clipboard in hand and a smug smile plastered across her face. Through my security cameras, I could hear Linda's voice carrying across the morning air as she gestured dramatically at my lawn. "As you can see, gentlemen, this unauthorized irrigation system is clearly wasting water resources and creating hazardous conditions for pedestrians. We've had reports of excess water runoff, slipping hazards, and potential damage to the municipal water system." I had to admire her quick response time, even if her claims were completely fabricated. I threw on some decent clothes and headed outside, but not before sending a quick text to Tom and Emily. This was exactly the kind of escalation we'd prepared for, and I couldn't help but smile thinking about the documentation we had ready. The code enforcement officer, a tired-looking man named Bill Jenkins, turned to me as I approached. "Sir, we've received multiple complaints about an unauthorized irrigation system on your property. We'll need to conduct an immediate inspection." His tone suggested this wasn't how he'd planned to spend his morning. "Of course," I replied cheerfully, pulling out my phone. "I have all the permits and documentation right here, but first, would you like to see why this system was necessary?" I played Emily's time-lapse video showing months of foot traffic destroying my lawn, followed by crystal-clear footage of Linda and her power-walking group repeatedly trespassing despite posted signs. The water inspector, Martha Ramirez, raised an eyebrow at Linda before turning back to me. "Sir, could you demonstrate this irrigation system? We need to verify its compliance with water conservation guidelines." I could see Linda's smug smile widening, obviously expecting the sprinklers to malfunction or prove her point about water waste. "Absolutely," I replied. "Tom, would you mind helping with the demonstration?" Tom, who had appeared seemingly out of nowhere with his engineering blueprints tucked under his arm, stepped forward. "As the systems engineer, I'd be happy to show you the water-efficient design and safety features." Linda's smile began to fade as Tom launched into a detailed technical explanation, complete with water pressure calculations and zone coverage. Maps. He'd brought documentation showing that our system actually used less water than traditional sprinklers, thanks to its targeted activation and precise coverage areas. The environmental compliance agent, Dr. James Foster, seemed particularly impressed by the moisture sensors we'd installed to prevent overwatering. "This is actually more efficient than most residential irrigation systems I have seen," he commented, making notes on his tablet. "And you say it only activates when someone steps off the designated walkway?" "That's correct," I confirmed, pulling up the system specifications on my phone. "It's designed to preserve the lawn by preventing soil compaction from foot traffic, while maintaining optimal irrigation levels." Emily Chen, our local landscaping expert, helped design the spray patterns to ensure minimum water usage with maximum effectiveness. Right on cue, Emily pulled up in her company truck, carrying a folder of before and after photos documenting the lawn damage. "I've been tracking the soil compaction and grass degradation caused by unauthorized foot traffic," she explained, spreading the photos out on her tailgate. "This system has actually helped restore several damaged areas while reducing overall water consumption." Linda's face had turned an interesting shade of red as each of her complaints was systematically dismantled by professional documentation, but she wasn't done yet. "What about the safety hazard?" she demanded. "We can't have water spraying at people who might need to cross the lawn in an emergency." Tom calmly pulled up the safety specifications. "The system includes multiple fail-safes," he explained. "Emergency personnel can easily deactivate it with a universal override code, which has been registered with local first responders. Plus, the spray pressure is specifically calibrated to be attention-getting without being harmful, much like the sprinklers used in public parks." Dr. Foster was nodding appreciatively. "Actually, Ms. Baker, this might be something the Environmental Office would like to study further. The targeted activation approach could serve as a model for water conservation in other communities." He turned to me. "Would you mind if we documented this system for our Sustainable Landscaping Initiative?" I could practically hear Linda's teeth grinding. But what about the violation notices? The system wasn't approved by the HOA board." She waved her clipboard frantically, papers fluttering in the morning breeze. Bill Jenkins, the code enforcement officer, had been quietly reviewing the permits and documentation. "Ms. Baker, everything appears to be in compliance with city codes. In fact," he paused, looking at his notes, "the only potential violation I'm seeing here involves repeated unauthorized access to private property, which could be a matter for local law enforcement." Martha Ramirez, the water inspector, closed her notebook with a decisive snap. "Well, I've seen everything I need to see. Mr. Wilson, your system actually exceeds our water conservation guidelines. We'll note that in our report. Ms. Baker, in the future, please verify complaints before requesting multiple agency inspections." And as the officials packed up their equipment and prepared to leave, Dave from the hardware store arrived with his morning delivery truck. "Oh, perfect timing," he called out. "Mark, those moisture sensors you ordered just came in. Should help make your system even more efficient." He nodded to the departing officials, then turned to Linda with an innocent smile. "By the way, Ms. Baker, the HOA's account at my store is still suspended until that payment issue is resolved. Just thought I'd remind you." Linda stood rooted to the sidewalk, clutching her now useless clipboard as her carefully orchestrated inspection turned into a celebration of innovative lawn care. Her face cycled through various shades of red as she watched Dr. Foster taking pictures of the sprinkler layout for his department's sustainability newsletter. Just then, Jennifer Walsh power walked past, carefully staying on the sidewalk. "Oh, Linda, I just posted the most interesting article on the community Facebook page about water conservation and property rights. You should check it out. You're featured prominently." She continued her walk without breaking stride, leaving Linda sputtering in her wake. As the last official vehicle pulled away, Linda finally found her voice. "This isn't over, Wilson. The HOA board will hear about this." She turned sharply, her clipboard clutched to her chest like armor, and stormed off down the sidewalk, notably avoiding any contact with my lawn. Tom leaned against his fence, grinning. "You know she's going to call an emergency board meeting, right?" I nodded, watching Linda's retreating figure. "That's exactly what we're counting on. Just wait until she finds out who else has been documenting her HOA overreach." The morning sun hit my perfectly maintained lawn, making the small water droplets from the morning's demonstrations sparkle like tiny diamonds. In the distance, I could hear Linda's voice rising as she made what was surely an angry phone call to someone about this latest setback. But for now, My lawn was safe, my sprinkler system was officially approved, and the next phase of our plan was already in motion. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock at the Evergreen Community Center, but by 6:30, the parking lot was already packed. Word had spread quickly through Jennifer's community Facebook page, and it seemed like half the neighborhood had shown up to witness what promised to be an interesting evening. I spotted several familiar faces in the crowd, including Dave from the hardware store and Emily Chen, who gave me a subtle thumbs up as I walked past. Linda Baker stood at the front of the room, shuffling papers with the kind of aggressive energy that suggested she'd spent the entire day preparing for this moment. The rest of the HOA board members were seated at the long table, looking uncomfortable as more and more residents filed into the room. Richard Thompson, the HOA vice president, kept checking his phone and frowning, while Susan Mitchell appeared to be having second thoughts about her usual unwavering support of Linda's initiatives. Tom Rodriguez slipped into the seat next to me, carrying a thick folder. "You're going to love this," he whispered, nodding toward the back of the room where Mike Peterson, the security camera installer, was setting up what looked suspiciously like a projection system. Linda has no idea what's coming. The meeting began with Linda's usual formality, but there was an edge to her voice that betrayed her agitation. "We're here today to address a serious violation of community standards," she announced, glaring in my direction, specifically the installation of an aggressive irrigation system designed to harass and intimidate law-abiding community members. A murmur ran through the crowd. I noticed several people trying to hide their smiles behind their hands. Someone in the back actually snorted with barely contained laughter. Linda pressed on, her voice rising. "Furthermore, this system poses a significant safety risk and has already resulted in multiple incidents of..." She paused dramatically, consulting her notes. "Water-based assault on HOA leadership personnel." Richard Thompson cleared his throat. "Linda, I've reviewed the documentation from this morning's inspections, and I have some concerns about pursuing this matter further. The system appears to be fully compliant with all relevant regulations." Linda waved his concerns away with an impatient gesture. "That's not the point, Richard. This is about maintaining order in our community. We can't have residents installing booby traps designed to spray innocent people who might need to cross their lawns." "Interesting choice of words," Tom spoke, rising from his seat, "especially the part about needing to cross private property. I've prepared a brief presentation that might help clarify some points about property rights and easements." Before Linda could object, Mike Peterson had the projector running, and Tom launched into what could only be described as a masterclass in property law and HOA overreach. He had everything: satellite images showing the worn paths across my lawn, time-stamped photos of Linda and her group trespassing, and even a chart comparing property values before and after excessive foot traffic damage. "As you can see," Tom continued, clicking through his slides, "the actual violation here isn't Mr. Wilson's irrigation system, but rather the systematic abuse of private property by certain individuals who seem to believe that HOA leadership grants them special privileges." The room had grown quiet, all eyes fixed on the screen, as Tom methodically dismantled every possible argument against the sprinkler system. He even included clips from security cameras showing Linda's group deliberately removing the "please use sidewalk" signs. Richard Thompson leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "Linda, did you authorize the removal of those signs? Because that could be considered destruction of private property." Linda's face had taken on that interesting shade of red again. "The signs violated our aesthetic guidelines. I was simply enforcing existing rules." "Actually," Emily Chen stood up, holding up her tablet. "I've reviewed the complete HOA guidelines, and there's nothing prohibiting tasteful please use sidewalk signs. I have copies of the relevant sections for anyone who'd like to review them." Jennifer Walsh, who had been quietly documenting everything on her phone, raised her hand. "I think it's worth noting that our community Facebook page has received over 300 comments in the past 2 days, overwhelmingly supporting Mr. Wilson's right to protect his property. Many residents have shared similar experiences with unauthorized lawn crossing." Linda's grip on her podium tightened. "The Facebook group is not an official HOA communication channel. This meeting is about a specific violation of community standards, not social media opinions." "Speaking of community standards," Dave Anderson called out from his seat, "maybe we should discuss the incident last month, when certain board members demanded special discounts from local businesses under threat of removal from the approved vendor list." The room erupted in shocked whispers. Susan Mitchell suddenly became very interested in her phone, while Linda's face cycled through several interesting expressions. Richard Thompson stood up, raising his hands for quiet. "I think we need to take a step back here. It's becoming clear that there are several issues that require the board's attention, and not all of them involve Mr. Wilson's sprinkler system." Tom seized the moment to display his final slide, a detailed analysis of water usage showing that my targeted sprinkler system actually used less water than conventional irrigation methods. "In fact," he concluded, "this system could serve as a model for sustainable lawn maintenance in our community." Dr. Foster from the Environmental Compliance Office was quite impressed. Linda tried one last time to regain control of the meeting. "This is ridiculous. Are we really going to let one resident undermine the authority of the HOA board with some fancy sprinklers and a PowerPoint presentation?" "No," Richard Thompson replied firmly. "We're going to acknowledge that the board may have overstepped its bounds in several areas and take steps to address these issues properly." He turned to address the room. "I move that we immediately cease any action against Mr. Wilson's irrigation system and form a committee to review current HOA policies regarding property rights and board member conduct." The vote was quick and decisive. Even Susan Mitchell raised her hand in favor, carefully avoiding Linda's outraged glare. As the meeting adjourned, residents gathered in small groups, discussing the evening's revelations with animated gestures and occasional bursts of laughter. Linda stormed out of the room, her heels clicking aggressively against the floor. As she passed my seat, she paused just long enough to hiss, "You have no idea what you've started." I couldn't help but smile. "Actually, Linda, I think we both know exactly what started. A long overdue conversation about respecting private property and the proper limits of HOA authority." As the crowd dispersed into the warm evening air, Tom clapped me on the shoulder. "Well done, but you know she's not going to let this go easily, right?" I nodded, watching Linda's car peel out of the parking lot. "I'm counting on it. After all, the sprinkler system was just phase 1 of our plan." Emily Chen joined us, grinning. "Just wait until she finds out about the motion-activated garden lights I've designed for your backyard. Some people really need to learn that karma can be both wet and bright." And the weekend after the HOA meeting brought an unexpected silence to Oakridge Heights. Linda's power walking group had mysteriously chosen a new route, carefully avoiding my street entirely. The worn paths across my lawn were starting to heal under Emily's expert care, and the sprinkler system stood guard, quietly waiting for its next uninvited guest. But as any homeowner who's dealt with an HOA knows, silence usually means something's brewing. Sure enough, Tuesday morning brought the first sign of Linda's countermove. I woke up to find my entire front yard marked with small yellow flags, the kind utility companies use to mark underground lines. Each flag had a tiny orange notice attached to it, citing various municipal codes and regulations. A work crew in official-looking uniforms, was methodically photographing each flag, while Linda supervised from her SUV, occasionally pointing and making notes on her ever-present clipboard. I was halfway to my front door when Tom's voice came through my phone. "Don't go out there yet," he warned. "Check your security cameras first. Something's not right about those workers." A quick review of the footage showed the crew arriving in unmarked personal vehicles rather than official utility trucks. More importantly, the timestamp showed they'd started work at 5:30 a.m., well before any legitimate utility work would begin in a residential area. Emily's truck pulled up across the street, and I watched as she casually walked over to inspect one of the flags while appearing to take photos of her recent landscaping work. She wandered back to her truck, picked up her phone, and within minutes, I received a text. "Fake flags, wrong color coding for actual utility marks. Someone's been shopping at the discount hardware store 3 towns over." I had to admire Linda's creativity, even if her execution needed work. She was trying to force a utility inspection that would require digging up my yard to verify the safety of underground lines near my sprinkler system. The problem was, we'd already handled all the proper utility marking when installing the system, and Tom had meticulously documented everything. Dave Anderson's voice crackled over our group chat. "Just got a call from Linda trying to verify a large order of utility flags supposedly placed by the city. Wanted to know if I could confirm it for some paperwork. Told her all official utility. Orders come through proper channels, not personal requests from HOA members." The fake utility crew was starting to look uncertain. One of them was on his phone, apparently realizing that impersonating utility workers might have legal consequences. They hadn't considered. Linda's face was visible through her SUV window, becoming increasingly frustrated as she made call after call. Richard Thompson, the HOA vice president, chose that moment to take his morning walk past my house. He stopped, surveyed the scene, and pulled out his phone. "Linda," his voice carried clearly across my lawn. "Why am I getting calls about unauthorized utility work in the neighborhood? The board hasn't approved any infrastructure projects." Linda emerged from her SUV, clipboard at the ready. "Richard, this is a safety inspection required by municipal code. These workers are here to verify the underground utility layout due to concerns about the irrigation system's impact on essential services." "Really?" Richard raised an eyebrow. "Because I just got off the phone with the actual utility department. They have no record of any scheduled inspections in our area, and they're quite concerned about reports of unauthorized persons marking utilities." The work crew started packing up their equipment with remarkable speed. Linda's protests about paperwork being in process did nothing to slow their hasty retreat. Within minutes, only Linda and her clipboard remained, along with dozens of fraudulent utility flags dotting my lawn. Jennifer Walsh, who had been live-streaming the entire scene to the community Facebook group, emerged from behind her carefully positioned dashboard camera. "Linda, would you care to comment on why you arranged for fake utility workers to trespass on private property? The community group members are very curious about your explanation." Mike Peterson chose that moment to adjust one of my security cameras, its lens gleaming in the morning sun. "Got everything recorded from 6 different angles," he announced, cheerfully, "including some great shots of those unmarked vehicles' license plates. Should make it easy for the utility company to track down who's been impersonating their workers." Linda's face had achieved a new shade of red as she realized her plan had completely unraveled. She opened her mouth to speak, then thought better of it and retreated to her SUV. As she pulled away, I could have sworn I heard her engine whining in frustration. Tom walked over, already pulling up the official utility documentation on his tablet. "Well, that was entertaining. Should we leave the flags up as evidence, or would you like to document everything and then restore your lawn to its flag-free state?" Emily was already photographing each flag's position and the attached citations. "These are actually kind of impressive forgeries," she mused. "Too bad she got the color coding wrong. Real utility companies are very specific about their marking systems." Richard Thompson lingered, shaking his head. "This has gone too far. First the sprinkler incident, now fake utility workers. We need to call an emergency board meeting to discuss Linda's position as HOA president." "Actually," Jennifer interjected, still recording, "you might want to check the comments on the community page first. There's some interesting history being shared about similar incidents in other neighborhoods where Linda used to live. Apparently, this isn't her first HOA power trip." The next few hours brought a parade of curious neighbors, each adding their own stories about encounters with Linda's unique approach to HOA leadership. Dave Anderson set up a lawn chair in front of his hardware store, happily sharing his collection of surveillance footage showing various attempted power plays by the HOA board. By afternoon, my yard was clear of flags, but the neighborhood was buzzing with speculation about what Linda might try next. Tom had already started designing additional security measures, while Emily worked on restoring the areas damaged by the morning's fraudulent utility marking. "You know," Mike Peterson remarked as he adjusted the final security camera, "we should probably thank Linda. She's managed to unite the entire neighborhood in a way that even the annual block party never achieved." I couldn't help but laugh, watching as another group of neighbors walked by, pointedly staying on the sidewalk while discussing the morning's events. The sprinkler system had started something bigger than just protecting my lawn. It had become a symbol of standing up to HOA overreach, and Linda's increasingly desperate attempts to reassert control were only making the community stronger. As the sun set on another eventful day in Oakridge Heights, I received one final text from Jennifer. "Emergency board meeting scheduled for tomorrow night. Linda doesn't know it yet, but her reign of terror is about to face its biggest sprinkler, yet democracy in action." The Evergreen Community Center buzzed with an energy usually reserved for contentious zoning meetings. Every seat was filled, with residents spilling into the hallway. Richard Thompson had called this emergency board meeting, but the community had turned it into something closer to a neighborhood revolution. The usual metal folding chairs had been supplemented with borrowed seats from the church next door, and someone had even set up a coffee station in the back. Mike Peterson's security company had volunteered to handle the audio-visual setup, ensuring every word would be clearly recorded. Jennifer Walsh sat in the front row, her laptop open to a live feed of the community Facebook page, where hundreds of comments were already flooding in from residents who couldn't attend in person. Linda Baker arrived exactly on time, dressed in what could only be described as corporate battle armor, a crisp charcoal suit that practically radiated authority. Her usual clipboard had been upgraded to a leather portfolio, and she'd brought reinforcements in the form of a man in an expensive suit who could only be her personal attorney. The crowd parted as she walked to the front, but not out of respect. There was a palpable tension in the air, like watching storm clouds gather before a downpour. Richard Thompson opened the meeting with uncharacteristic formality. "Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the unprecedented turnout tonight. It's clear that recent events have raised serious concerns about HOA leadership and the boundaries of board authority." He paused, adjusting his glasses. "We have documented evidence of several incidents that require immediate attention." Linda's attorneys stepped forward, but Richard held up his hand. "Mr. Mitchell, while you're welcome to observe, this is an internal HOA matter. The board's bylaws are quite clear about external participation in emergency sessions." The attorney subsided, but not before whispering something to Linda that made her smile. The kind of smile that suggested she had an ace up her sleeve. She stood, smoothing her jacket. As HOA president, I move to dismiss this meeting as unnecessary and potentially harmful to community interests. These so-called incidents are simply standard enforcement of existing regulations. That's when Dave Anderson stood up, carrying a thick binder. Standard enforcement? Like threatening local businesses? With removal from approved vendor lists unless they provide personal discounts. He opened the binder, pulling out security camera stills showing Linda attempting to leverage her HOA position for personal gain. Emily Chen was next, armed with a professional presentation on her tablet. Or perhaps you mean standard enforcement, like hiring fake utility workers to place fraudulent marking flags. I have documentation from 3 separate utility companies confirming that no such work was authorized. Linda's composure cracked slightly. Those investigations were properly initiated due to safety concerns about unauthorized irrigation systems. Her voice had taken on a shrill edge that made several board members wince. Tom Rodriguez calmly raised his hand. Speaking of irrigation systems, I've prepared a comprehensive report on the actual safety features and water conservation benefits of Mr. Wilson's sprinkler installation. Would the board like to review the technical specifications again? Susan Mitchell, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. Linda, you told me that sprinkler system was illegal. You said we had documentation proving it violated multiple codes. She turned to face the room. I think it's time we reviewed all recent HOA decisions and enforcement actions. The attorney touched Linda's arm, clearly suggesting she remain silent, but Linda was too far gone. This is ridiculous. You're all being manipulated by one rebellious homeowner and his excessive response to simple property maintenance requests. Jennifer Walsh stood, her laptop displaying a damning collection of evidence. Simple requests, like these emails showing coordinated harassment of multiple homeowners, or these screenshots of you organizing group trespassing under the guise of community inspections. She turned her screen toward the crowd. I've received over 50 similar complaints from residents, all documented with photos, videos, and written correspondence. Richard Thompson cleared his throat. Linda, in light of this evidence, I move to immediately suspend your position as HOA president pending a full investigation of these allegations. Linda's laugh had an edge of desperation. You can't remove me. I've done everything by the book. My attorney will prove that every action was within HOA guidelines. That's when an elderly resident, Mrs. Garcia, who had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone, slowly stood up. The room fell silent as she made her way to the front. I've seen 5 HOA presidents come and go, she said, her voice quiet but clear. None of them needed an attorney to explain why they deserved to lead our community. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Even Linda's attorney seemed to sense it, gathering his papers with a resigned expression. But Linda wasn't finished. She pulled out what she clearly thought was her trump card, a thick folder of violation notices. If you remove me, every one of these violations will be filed officially. Property values will plummet. Insurance rates will skyrocket. Is that what you all want? Her threat hung in the air like smoke. Richard Thompson smiled for the first time that evening. Actually, Linda, we've already contacted the State HOA Oversight Committee. They're very interested in reviewing your tenure as president, particularly your methods of documentation and enforcement. The color drained from Linda's face as she realized the implications. Her attorney was already heading for the door, pausing only to hand her his card with what looked like an hourly rate hastily scribbled on the back. The vote was quick and unanimous. Even Susan Mitchell raised her hand to support Linda's removal, though she couldn't quite meet her former friend's eyes. As Linda gathered her things, she turned to face me one last time. This isn't over. You have no idea what you've started. Tom Rodriguez stepped forward, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. Actually, Linda, I think it is over. But you're right about one thing. Something has started. The community has finally remembered what it means to stand together against bullying, whether it comes with a clipboard or a fake utility worker's vest. As Linda stormed out, the room erupted in applause. Richard Thompson quickly established an interim leadership committee with Mrs. Garcia nominated as special advisor. The energy in the room had transformed from tension to celebration, with neighbors who had barely spoken before now eagerly discussing plans for genuine community improvements. Emily Chen caught my eye from across the room, grinning as she held up her phone to show me the latest comment on Jennifer's live feed. First order of business, community-wide sprinkler system maintenance workshop. Ooh. The suggestion earned a round of laughter, but there was truth behind the joke. Sometimes it takes something as simple as a sprinkler system to wash away years of accumulated fear and compliance, revealing the strong community that was there all along. The morning after Linda's removal brought an unexpected sight to Oakridge Heights. A group of residents had gathered at the community park, armed with coffee, donuts, and detailed maps of the neighborhood. Mrs. Garcia sat at a folding table, sharing stories about the community's history, while Richard Thompson and the interim committee members discussed plans for positive changes. My phone buzzed with messages from Emily Chen, who was already working on a comprehensive landscaping proposal. "You won't believe this," she wrote, "but 3 other neighborhoods have contacted me about installing similar sprinkler systems. Apparently, HOA overreach isn't unique to Oakridge Heights." Tom Rodriguez appeared on my porch with his signature grin and a stack of papers. "The state HOA Oversight Committee called. They want to use our documentation as a case study for their training programs. Seems we've sparked something bigger than just our little sprinkler rebellion." Inside the house, my security cameras caught an unusual amount of activity on the street. Instead of hurrying past with suspicious glances, neighbors were stopping to chat. The worn paths across various lawns were being replaced with proper stepping stones and community-approved walkways. Someone had even started a neighborhood task force to review and update the outdated HOA guidelines. Dave Anderson's hardware store had become an unofficial community center. His coffee machine ran constantly as residents dropped by to share ideas and pick up supplies for home improvements. The approved vendor list, once Linda's weapon of choice, was being transformed into a genuine resource for local businesses and homeowners alike. A distinctive SUV caught my attention as it slowly drove past my house. Linda Baker, now former HOA president, was conducting what appeared to be a farewell tour of her former kingdom. She wasn't alone. Susan Mitchell sat in the passenger seat, and the expression on both their faces suggested they were processing recent events very differently. Jennifer Walsh's live updates had evolved into a proper community newsletter featuring positive stories about neighborhood improvements and upcoming events. The latest post showed pictures of the new walking path being installed around the community park, a direct response to the lawn crossing issues that had started everything. Mike Peterson's security company had seen an unexpected boom in business, but not for the reasons anyone might have expected. Instead of installing cameras to catch violations, residents were setting up systems to document their property improvements and share tips with neighbors. The atmosphere of suspicion was being replaced by one of collaboration. At noon, Susan Mitchell surprised everyone by appearing at my door alone. Her usual power-walking outfit had been replaced by casual wear, and she carried a small notebook instead of violation notices. "I owe you an apology," she began, shifting uncomfortably. "I was so caught up in following Linda's lead that I forgot what community really means." We sat on my porch watching as a group of kids rode their bikes past, something that had become rare during Linda's reign due to her strict rules about proper recreational activities. Susan explained how Linda's influence had gradually transformed the HOA from a community organization into something more akin to a personal fiefdom. She had a way of making everything sound reasonable, Susan admitted, opening her notebook, to reveal years of documented incidents. First it was about property values, then community standards, then personal loyalty. Before we knew it, we were all just following orders without questioning why. As we talked, more neighbors began gathering around, adding their own stories to the discussion. Mrs. Garcia brought her famous lemonade, and soon my front yard, the same yard that had been the battleground for so much conflict, became the site of an impromptu community meeting. Richard Thompson arrived with updated copies of the HOA bylaws, now annotated with proposed changes to prevent future abuses of power. "We're thinking of implementing a rotation system for board positions," he explained. "No more indefinite terms or concentrated authority." Emily Chen spread out her landscaping plans on a portable table. Her vision for the neighborhood incorporated both beauty and functionality, with dedicated walking paths, community gardens, and sustainable irrigation systems. "We can maintain high standards without resorting to intimidation," she pointed out. Tom Rodriguez demonstrated a simplified version of the sprinkler system design that had started it all, modified to help residents maintain their lawns efficiently. "It's about using technology to solve problems, not create conflicts," he explained to an interested group of homeowners. Dave Anderson announced that his hardware store would be hosting weekly workshops on home maintenance and improvement projects. "Knowledge sharing builds stronger communities than rule enforcement ever could," he declared, passing out flyers. For the first session, as the afternoon wore on, Jennifer Walsh captured the evolving spirit of Oakridge Heights through her lens. Her photos showed neighbors helping each other with yard work, children playing freely on maintained lawns, and former adversaries sharing gardening tips. The transformation was visible not just in the physical landscape, but in the faces of the residents. A noise from the street drew everyone's attention. Linda's SUV had returned, but this time she didn't just drive by. She parked, stepped out, and stood watching the gathered community with an unreadable expression. For a moment, tension rippled through the crowd. Then Mrs. Garcia did something unexpected. She walked over to Linda, lemonade in hand, and simply said, "Would you like to join us? We're discussing ways to make the neighborhood better for everyone." The silence that followed felt endless, but it was broken by Linda's quiet response. "I thought that's what I was doing all along." "The difference," Richard Thompson called out, "is that we're doing it together now, not through force." He held up the revised bylaws. "There's room for everyone's input, including yours, if you're willing to be a neighbor instead of a ruler." Linda stood frozen for a moment, then slowly accepted the lemonade. She didn't join the group immediately, but she didn't leave either. Instead, she sat on the edge of the gathering, listening as the community she tried to control through rules and regulations came together naturally through cooperation and respect. My sprinkler system remained armed and ready, but its purpose had evolved. It was no longer just a defense against trespassers. It had become a symbol of how one small act of resistance could catalyze positive change. As I watched Linda, tentatively, engage with her former subjects as equals, I realized that sometimes the best way to defeat an opponent is to transform them into a neighbor. The transformative peace in Oakridge Heights lasted exactly 2 weeks before a new challenge emerged from an unexpected direction. A sleek black Tesla pulled into the neighborhood one sunny morning, carrying Margaret Winters, the regional HOA oversight director. She hadn't come to check on Linda's removal or investigate past incidents. Instead, she arrived with concerns about our community's sudden departure from standard HOA operational procedures. Mrs. Garcia spotted the visitor first, recognizing the official vehicle from her years of community involvement. Within minutes, our now practiced communication network sprang into action. Jennifer Walsh's phone lit up with messages. Tom Rodriguez emerged from his garage with a suspicious amount of paperwork, and Emily Chen conveniently scheduled some nearby landscaping work. Margaret Winters exuded corporate efficiency as she strode into the community center, her tablet displaying metrics and compliance ratings that seemingly proved Oakridge Heights was veering dangerously off course. According to her data, our property values should have plummeted without strict enforcement of traditional HOA policies. Instead, they had risen, and this statistical anomaly demanded investigation. Richard Thompson welcomed her with the calm confidence of someone who had done his homework. The interim committee had anticipated this visit, knowing that our successful rebellion might threaten the status quo of HOA governance throughout the region. What Margaret didn't expect was the thorough documentation of our community's transformation. Dave Anderson arrived with his laptop, displaying sales figures from local businesses that showed a significant uptick in home improvement investments. Turns out, he explained, when people aren't afraid of getting violation notices, they're more likely to take pride in their property upgrades. Emily Chen's presentation revealed a 30% reduction in water usage across the neighborhood, thanks to the widespread adoption of smart irrigation systems inspired by my original sprinkler setup. The environmental impact report made even Margaret's carefully maintained professional expression crack slightly, but it was Mrs. Garcia who truly changed the tone of the investigation. She brought out her personal archive of neighborhood photos, dating back decades. The before and after images told a compelling story, not just of physical improvements, but of community engagement. Where recent photos under Linda's leadership showed empty streets and closed blinds, new images captured neighbors chatting on front porches and children playing freely. Margaret Winters tapped her tablet with manicured nails, frowning at data that refused to align with her expectations. "While your community spirit is admirable," she began, "there are concerns about maintaining consistent standards across all HOA-governed neighborhoods. Your recent changes could be seen as destabilizing." Susan Mitchell chose that moment to share her meticulously kept records from her time as Linda's ally. Her documentation showed how rigid enforcement had actually increased property maintenance costs and decreased community satisfaction. "We were measuring the wrong things," she explained. "Writing more violations didn't make our neighborhood better, it just made it more fearful." The regional director's skepticism began to waver as Tom Rodriguez presented his analysis of emergency response times, improved now that residents actually communicated with each other instead of filing anonymous complaints. Mike Peterson's security data showed a decrease in reported incidents, despite more cameras than ever recording neighborhood activity. Jennifer Walsh's community engagement metrics were particularly damning to the old system. Her graphs showed exponential growth in voluntary community service hours, neighbor-to-neighbor assistance programs, and participation in improvement initiatives. "People want to contribute," she explained, "when they feel like part of a community rather than subjects of a regime." As if on cue, Linda Baker herself appeared at the meeting. Her entrance caused a momentary hush, but her purpose surprised everyone. She had brought her own records, not to defend her past actions, but to illustrate how the system had encouraged abuse of power. "I became so focused on rules and control," she admitted, "that I forgot why HOAs exist in the first place." Margaret Winters set down her tablet, momentarily at a loss. The data before her challenged everything she knew about homeowners association management. Property values were up, maintenance costs were down, and community satisfaction had skyrocketed. More importantly, these improvements had happened because of reduced restrictions, not increased enforcement. What you're suggesting, she said carefully, would require a fundamental shift in how we approach community governance. Her words carried weight beyond our neighborhood's boundaries. If Oakridge Heights could succeed with this model, other communities might question their own rigid structures. Richard Thompson seized the moment. We're not suggesting abandoning standards, he clarified. We're demonstrating that those standards can be maintained through cooperation rather than coercion. Look at our results. They speak for themselves. Mrs. Garcia gently placed a photo album in front of Margaret. It showed the evolution of my lawn from the original conflict through its current state as a model of water-efficient landscaping. Sometimes, she said softly, the best rules are the ones that encourage people to be good neighbors, naturally. The regional director spent the rest of the afternoon touring our transformed neighborhood. She saw the new walking paths that had replaced worn lawn shortcuts, the community garden projects that had sprouted in previously restricted spaces, and the genuine interaction between neighbors who had once avoided each other. At my house, the sprinkler system performed a choreographed demonstration of its efficiency features. Margaret watched with growing interest as Tom explained how technology could support community standards without creating conflict. Your irrigation system, she noted, has better compliance metrics than most traditional enforcement policies. By sunset, Margaret Winters had filled her tablet with new data. Not just numbers and compliance rates, but examples of successful community-driven governance. She stood in the community center parking lot, surveying the neighborhood with fresh eyes. I came here expecting to find chaos, she admitted. Instead, I found something that might change how we think about HOA management entirely. As her Tesla quietly pulled away, the gathered neighbors shared knowing looks. Our small rebellion over lawn crossing and sprinkler rights had evolved into something much bigger, a model for community-led change that challenged the fundamental assumptions of traditional HOA governance. The question now wasn't whether our approach would spread to other neighborhoods, but how quickly they would demand similar transformations. News travels fast in suburban communities, but innovation travels even faster when it involves standing up to HOA overreach. Within days of Margaret Winters' visit, curious visitors from neighboring developments began appearing in Oakridge Heights. They came quietly at first, casually driving through on weekend afternoons, smartphones discreetly recording our transformed community spaces. The catalyst for wider attention came from Pine Valley Estates, the upscale development 3 miles away. Their HOA president, Robert Maxwell, had earned a reputation for making Linda Baker look positively permissive in comparison. When several Pine Valley residents spotted the newly installed community walking paths and garden spaces in Oakridge Heights, they began questioning their own neighborhood's restrictive policies. Emily Chen's phone started ringing non-stop with requests for consultations. They all want to know about the sprinkler system, she explained during one of our now regular community coffee mornings. But what they're really asking about is permission to think differently about their neighborhoods. Tom Rodriguez found himself hosting impromptu engineering workshops in his garage. Homeowners from across the county brought photos of their properties, seeking advice on how to protect their spaces while promoting community engagement. His original sprinkler system designs evolved into comprehensive property enhancement plans that emphasized both individual rights and community cooperation. Dave Anderson's hardware store became a hub for this growing movement. He set up a dedicated corner with resources for HOA reform, including copies of our revised bylaws and documentation of successful community initiatives. The story of our sprinkler rebellion, now legendary in local circles, served as inspiration for others facing similar challenges. One morning, Robert Maxwell himself appeared at my door, his expensive suit looking out of place in our increasingly casual neighborhood. "I need to understand," he declared. "How you've maintained property values while dismantling traditional enforcement structures." His presence attracted immediate attention, and within minutes, several neighbors had casually gathered on nearby porches. Mrs. Garcia emerged from her house with her signature lemonade, followed by Richard Thompson carrying our community impact reports. The impromptu meeting moved to my front yard, the very space where our revolution had begun. Robert watched in barely concealed amazement as neighbors freely crossed on designated paths, greeting each other warmly while respecting property boundaries. Jennifer Walsh documented the visit for her now regional community engagement newsletter. Her photos captured the moment Robert realized his clipboard and penalty approach to community management was becoming obsolete. The expression on his face when he learned about our increased property values was worth every drop of water my sprinkler system had dispensed in defense of lawn justice. Susan Mitchell, fully embracing her role as reformed enforcer, shared insights about the psychological impact of moving from punishment to cooperation. "We used to measure success by the number of violations issued," she explained to Robert. "Now we measure it by the number of neighbors helping neighbors." The ripple effect spread beyond just HOA policies. Local businesses began adopting our community-first approach. The garden center near Dave's hardware store created a neighborhood beautification program, offering discounts to communities that implemented resident-friendly policies. The local landscaping association, inspired by Emily's work, developed guidelines for sustainable community-oriented design. Mike Peterson's security company shifted focus entirely, moving from surveillance-based services to community engagement technology. His cameras now monitored community spaces for maintenance needs rather than violations, and his software helped coordinate neighborhood improvement projects. Even Linda Baker found a new role in this expanding movement. Her intimate knowledge of traditional HOA tactics made her invaluable consultant for communities seeking change. She began working with Richard Thompson to develop transition plans for other neighborhoods, turning her former weapons of control into tools for transformation. The momentum built until it caught the attention of the local media. A news crew arrived to document the sprinkler revolution, as they called it. They found not just a story about standing up to authority, but a blueprint for community renewal. The reporter seemed particularly amused by the carefully mapped sprinkler zones that had started it all. Margaret Winters returned, this time with representatives from the state HOA Oversight Committee. They spent a full day studying our systems and interviewing residents. The resulting report would later be cited in proposed legislation aimed at reforming HOA governance structures statewide. Tom's Garage workshops evolved into formal community planning sessions, with residents from various neighborhoods sharing ideas and experiences. The spirit of cooperation that had emerged from our conflict with Linda spread like wildfire, igniting similar transformations across the region. Dave Anderson expanded his store to include a community resource center where HOA reform groups could meet and plan their own transitions. The wall behind his counter became a gallery of before and after photos from various neighborhoods, each telling a story of positive change. What amazed everyone most was how naturally the transformation spread. Once people saw that maintaining community standards didn't require militant enforcement, the old system's flaws became impossible to ignore. Property values rose not because of strict rules, but because people genuinely cared about their community and their neighbors. Mrs. Garcia's historical perspective proved invaluable as other neighborhoods began their own journeys. Communities are like gardens, she would tell visitors. They thrive with proper care and attention, not with constant pruning and restrictions. The sprinkler system that had started it all became something of a local landmark. Tour groups from other HOAs would stop by to see it, often staying to learn about the broader changes it had inspired. Emily added educational signage explaining both its technical features and its role in sparking community reform. As autumn approached, the first regional community cooperation summit was planned, with Oakridge Heights hosting representatives from dozens of neighborhoods. The agenda included sessions on everything from sustainable landscaping to conflict resolution. But the most popular workshop remained, from sprinklers to solutions, transforming HOA governance. Richard Thompson summed it up best during one of the planning meetings. We didn't just change how we manage our community, we changed how people think about community itself. And it all started because someone decided that crossing a lawn without permission wasn't just a violation of property rights, but an opportunity for positive change. The movement we'd started had grown beyond anything we could have imagined, proving that sometimes the most powerful revolutions start with the simplest acts of resistance. As I watched another group of visitors admiring our community spaces, I couldn't help but smile. My sprinkler system stood ready as always, but these days it rarely needed to remind anyone about respecting boundaries. The community had learned that lesson all on its own. The state capitol building loomed ahead as our caravan of community. Representatives made its way through morning traffic. What had started with a simple sprinkler system had led to this moment, a legislative hearing on comprehensive HOA reform. Richard Thompson sat beside me in the lead car, reviewing his testimony notes, while Tom Rodriguez followed in his truck, loaded with technical documentation and community impact studies. Inside the hearing room, familiar faces filled the gallery. Emily Chen sat with a group of environmental scientists, ready to present data on sustainable community management. Dave Anderson had closed his hardware store for the day, bringing along customer testimonials about the positive impact of reformed HOA policies. Even Linda Baker was present, though she now sat with a coalition of reformed HOA presidents advocating for change. State Senator Marina Collins opened the session with unexpected humor. We're here today to discuss the so-called sprinkler revolution that has transformed community governance across our state. Though I must admit, when I first heard about sprinklers being used to defend property rights, I thought my staff was playing an early April Fool's joke. The laughter that rippled through the chamber broke the tension, but the serious implications of our movement quickly became clear. One by one, community representatives stepped forward to share their experiences. Susan Mitchell presented compelling statistics showing reduced conflict and increased property values under reformed HOA structures. Jennifer Walsh's documentation of community engagement metrics drew particular interest from the Legislative Committee. Mrs. Garcia's testimony proved especially powerful. She spoke about witnessing decades of HOA evolution, from helpful community organizations to restrictive enforcement entities and back again to community-focused governance. Her simple statement, "We remembered how to be neighbors instead of adversaries," resonated throughout the chamber. Margaret Winters, now a vocal advocate for reform, presented her department's findings. The data was undeniable. Communities that adopted our cooperative model showed significant improvements across every measurable metric. Property values increased more steadily, maintenance costs decreased, and resident satisfaction scores reached unprecedented levels. Mike Peterson's security analysis revealed another surprising trend. Communities that shifted from punitive enforcement to cooperative governance saw dramatic decreases in vandalism and property disputes. His cameras, once tools of surveillance, now documented the positive transformation of neighborhood spaces. The opposition came primarily from traditional HOA management companies, who argued that standardized enforcement was necessary for maintaining community standards. Their arguments fell flat when faced with our real-world results. Robert Maxwell, once their strongest ally, now testified about the successful transformation of Pine Valley estates using our model. During the lunch recess, an unexpected visitor approached our group. Sarah Martinez, a representative from the National Community Association Institute, expressed interest in studying our reform model for potential nationwide implementation. "What you've started here," she admitted, "challenges everything we thought we knew about effective community governance." The afternoon session focused on specific policy recommendations. Tom Rodriguez presented technical guidelines for community-friendly property protection measures, using our sprinkler system as a case study in balancing individual rights with community interests. His engineering approach to conflict resolution drew appreciative nods from the technical committee members. Emily Chen's presentation on sustainable community design sparked particular interest. Her plans for integrated walking paths, community gardens, and efficient irrigation systems demonstrated how environmental responsibility could enhance rather than restrict property rights. Several legislators requested detailed copies of her proposals for their own districts. Dave Anderson shared how local businesses had thrived under the new community model. His hardware store's community resource center had become a template for merchant-resident cooperation, proving that economic interests and community welfare could align perfectly. The Commerce Committee took special note of the increased local spending in reformed HOA communities. The most compelling testimony came from everyday residents who had experienced both systems. They spoke about the transformation from living in fear of violation notices to actively participating in community improvement. Stories of neighbors helping neighbors replaced tales of anonymous complaints and retaliatory actions. Linda Baker's testimony proved unexpectedly moving. She described her journey from enforcer to reformer, acknowledging how the old system had corrupted good intentions into weapons of control. Her insights into preventing future abuses of power drew careful attention from the legislative drafting committee. As the day progressed, it became clear that the hearing was more than just a legislative formality. Senator Collins announced the formation of a special committee to draft comprehensive HOA reform legislation, using our community's model as a foundation. The sprinkler principles, as they became known, would form the basis for a new approach to community governance. The media coverage extended far beyond local news. National outlets picked up the story, fascinated by how a simple property dispute had sparked a revolution in community management. Interviews and information requests poured in from across the country, each seeking to understand how a sprinkler system had washed away decades of HOA orthodoxy. Outside the capital, informal discussions continued well into the evening. Representatives from other states quietly took notes, recognizing the potential for similar reforms in their jurisdictions. The movement we'd started had grown beyond our small community, beyond our state, becoming a template for nationwide change. Mrs. Garcia, watching the sunset from the Capitol steps, summed up the day perfectly. Sometimes, the most powerful changes come from the simplest stand for dignity. Who would have thought a few well-placed sprinklers could wash away years of misguided policies and remind us all what community really means? As we packed up our presentations and prepared to head home, Senator Collins approached with one final question. "Have you considered," she asked with a thoughtful smile, "that your sprinkler system might just have launched the most significant reform in community governance since the creation of HOAs themselves?" The answer, of course, was still spraying water on unauthorized lawn crossers back in Oakridge Heights, reminding everyone that sometimes the best revolution is the one that makes people laugh while it makes them think. 1 year to the day after the first sprinkler activation, Oakridge Heights hosted a unique celebration. The community gathered on my lawn, yes, that same lawn where it all began, for what everyone now affectionately called the Sprinkler Festival. Children ran through carefully programmed water displays while their parents shared stories and laughed about the changes that had transformed not just our neighborhood, but communities across the nation. Tom Rodriguez had outdone himself with the sprinkler choreography, syncing the water patterns to music in a display that put most fountain shows to shame. Emily Chen's landscaping vision had turned the entire neighborhood into a model of sustainable beauty, with dedicated paths connecting community spaces that once had been forbidden territories under the old regime. Dave Anderson's hardware store had expanded into a franchise, spreading the community resource center concept across 3 states. His original store wall, covered in transformation photos, had been professionally preserved and turned into a traveling exhibition about community reform. Currently, it was being featured at a Smithsonian exhibit on modern suburban evolution. Richard Thompson stood chatting with visiting HOA representatives from California, explaining how our governance model had evolved beyond simple rule enforcement into true community facilitation. The visitors took careful notes, particularly interested in how property values had continued to rise, even as restrictions were replaced with cooperative guidelines. Jennifer Walsh had transformed her community updates into a nationally syndicated column on neighborhood engagement. Her latest piece, From Sprinklers to Symphony, How Community Harmony Replaced HOA Discord, was trending on social media. She moved through the crowd, capturing moments for her next article, her camera catching genuine smiles instead of the forced compliance of the past. Linda Baker's transformation remained perhaps the most remarkable. She now headed a consulting firm specializing in HOA reform, helping communities transition from enforcement-based to cooperation-based governance. Her first-hand experience with both systems made her uniquely qualified to guide others through the change. Today, she stood near my infamous sprinkler control panel, explaining to a group of fascinated HOA presidents how her perspective had shifted from seeing it as an act of defiance to recognizing it as a catalyst for necessary change. Mrs. Garcia had set up her lemonade stand near the community bulletin board, which now displayed news of achievements rather than violation notices. Her stories of the neighborhood's evolution had been recorded by the State Historical Society, preserving the journey from conflict to cooperation for future generations to study. Mike Peterson's security company had revolutionized community monitoring, focusing on connecting neighbors rather than catching violations. His cameras now powered a neighborhood assistance network, alerting residents to opportunities to help each other rather than chances to report infractions. Today, his system coordinated the festival activities, ensuring everyone could participate in the celebration. Susan Mitchell had just returned from a national conference where she presented research on the psychological benefits of cooperative community governance. Her data showed significant improvements in resident mental health and social connections in communities that had adopted our model. She shared her findings with a group of university researchers who had come to study our neighborhood's transformation. The state legislature's HOA reform bill, now known nationally as the Sprinkler Standard, had passed with unprecedented bipartisan support. Senator Collins attended our celebration, proudly announcing that 12 other states had adopted similar legislation. She brought news that federal guidelines for community associations were being revised based on our experience. Margaret Winters, who had once come to investigate our deviation from HOA norms, now directed the new Office of Community Cooperation. Her department used our neighborhood as a training ground for community leaders, learning to transition from enforcement to engagement. Today, She led a workshop under the shade of the oak trees that lined our reformed walking paths. Robert Maxwell from Pine Valley Estates brought his own success story to share. His community's transformation had been even faster than ours, proving that the model could be replicated and improved upon. The rivalry between our neighborhoods had transformed into a partnership, with joint events and shared resources becoming the norm. As evening approached, the celebration moved to the newly expanded community center. The space that once hosted tense HOA violation hearings now buzzed with activity as residents shared meals and planned future improvements. The walls displayed children's artwork instead of rule postings, and the former violation filing cabinet had been repurposed as a suggestion box for community projects. Emily Chen unveiled plans for the next phase of community enhancement, a network of pollinator gardens that would connect all the neighborhoods in our area. The project embodied our new approach, beautiful, functional, and designed to bring people together rather than keep them apart. The sprinkler system that started it all remained operational, but its role had evolved. Now it served as both a practical irrigation system and a monument to positive change. Children delighted in its carefully timed displays, while adults appreciated the subtle reminder that sometimes the most effective revolution is one that brings joy while making its point. The sun set on our celebration as neighbors lingered, reluctant to see the day end. The evening air filled with the sound of laughter and genuine conversation, a sound that had replaced the tense silence of the enforcement era. String lights twinkled in the gathering dusk, illuminating faces that showed the contentment of people truly at home in their community. Looking out over the transformed landscape, I remembered the tension of that first confrontation, the uncertainty of challenging established authority, and the surprise of finding allies in unexpected places. The sprinkler system still stood ready to defend against unauthorized lawn crossing, but its real victory wasn't in keeping people off the grass. It was in showing them a better path forward. Mrs. Garcia's final toast captured the spirit perfectly. To sprinklers and awakening, to neighbors and friendship, and to the simple truth that sometimes the best way to protect what's yours is to share it with those who respect it. As the festival wound down, Linda Baker approached me one last time. "You know," she said, looking at the sprinkler heads that had once been her nemesis, "sometimes the best lessons come with a bit of water to wash away our preconceptions." She smiled, an expression that would have once seemed impossible. "Thank you for teaching me how to be a neighbor instead of an enforcer." The celebration ended, but its impact continued to ripple outward, touching communities far beyond our suburban boundaries. The Great Sprinkler Uprising, as it came to be known, had shown that positive change often comes from unexpected sources, even from a simple lawn irrigation system with perfect timing and a point to make. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.